The Black Death was not history's first great pandemic. It was not even the deadliest relative to the world it struck. 8 centuries before wagons of the dead rolled through the streets of 14th century Europe, a nearly identical horror had already swept out of Egypt, climbed the trade routes of the Mediterranean, and emptied a capital city of the ancient world at a rate some contemporary witnesses believed might extinguish the human race entirely. Most people alive today have never heard its name. Fewer still know that modern science has confirmed something the 2 catastrophes' contemporaries could never have guessed, that the same species of bacterium, Yersinia pestis, caused them both, separated by 800 years and an ocean of forgetting. This is the story of the Plague of Justinian, named for the Byzantine emperor who ruled while it burned through his empire, and who very nearly died of it himself. It begins with a single grain ship, sailing out of a port most listeners will never have heard of, carrying, unnoticed among its cargo, the beginning of the end for as much as a third of the people living around the Mediterranean Sea. It is a story about how thoroughly a single, invisible catastrophe can rewrite the fate of empires, bending the outcome of wars already being fought, hollowing out treasuries already spread thin, and setting in motion changes across the ancient world that would still be felt 300 years later, long after anyone who remembered the plague's first arrival had themselves been dead for generations. You may already sense, from the sheer scale involved, that this is not a light story, and it isn't. But it is told here the way this channel tells every story, carefully, patiently, and without the need to linger on suffering for its own sake, because what actually happened here is remarkable enough without embellishment. If unhurried, thoroughly researched history is the kind of thing that helps you drift towards sleep, there's a subscribe button nearby, worth using only if these long evenings genuinely serve you. Dim the lights if you haven't already, get comfortable, and let the ancient Mediterranean world unfold slowly around you, the way it actually happened, 800 years before anyone thought to call any of it a Black Death at all. Consider, for a moment, what makes this particular story worth an entire evening rather than a single startling fact recited and set aside. It is not simply that people died in enormous numbers, though they did. Plenty of ancient catastrophes did that, and most of them remain, quite fairly, footnotes. What makes the Plague of Justinian different is how completely it reached into every layer of a functioning civilization at once, its emperor's own body, its treasury's ledgers, its armies already fighting a war on the far side of the Mediterranean, its trade ships, its farmland, its faith, and, eventually, the fate of 2 rival empires that between them controlled nearly the entire known world west of China. Few single events in the ancient record touch that many threads simultaneously, and fewer still have spent 15 centuries waiting for the science that would finally prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly what had done it. Think, too, about what it means for a catastrophe of this size to have been genuinely, honestly forgotten by most of the world for the better part of 1500 years, not suppressed. Not hidden by any deliberate act, simply outlived by a more famous successor and left to specialists and footnotes until modern laboratories finally gave it back its true shape. That kind of forgetting says something about how history actually gets remembered, which turns out to have considerably less to do with how many people a catastrophe genuinely killed, and considerably more to do with who survived to write about it, in what language, and how completely later centuries chose to keep reading what they left behind. It begins not in a palace or a battlefield, but in a granary, the vast, sun-baked warehouses of a Nile Delta port that fed an empire, and that, in the year 541, fed something else into that empire's bloodstream entirely by accident. To understand what the plague actually took from the world, it helps to first understand what that world looked like in the years just before it arrived, because the empire the plague struck was not some fading, exhausted power already in decline. It was, by most contemporary estimates, near the peak of its ambition. Justinian I had become emperor in 527, inheriting an Eastern Roman state that had, over the preceding century, settled into an uneasy but genuinely prosperous existence, its Western counterpart already gone, fractured into a patchwork of Germanic successor kingdoms, while Constantinople itself remained the largest, wealthiest, most fortified city anywhere in the late antique world. Justinian did not intend to simply preside over that inheritance. He intended to reclaim what Rome had lost. By 540, his brilliant general Belisarius had already reconquered Vandal North Africa in a lightning campaign and pushed deep into Ostrogothic Italy, capturing Ravenna itself and, for one triumphant moment, making it plausible that the Mediterranean might once again become, in practice as well as in imperial rhetoric, a Roman lake. At home, Justinian's building program was reshaping Constantinople's skyline in ways that would outlast his entire dynasty, the Hagia Sophia, rebuilt after the Nika riots had burned its predecessor to the ground in 532, had been completed only a handful of years earlier, its enormous dome rising over the city as a deliberate, unmistakable statement of imperial confidence. The city beneath that dome was, by the standards of its era, staggeringly large. Estimates place its population somewhere in the range of 400,000 to 500,000 people. A scale matched almost nowhere else in the world outside of a handful of Chinese and Middle Eastern capitals. It ran on grain, most of it shipped in from Egypt's astonishingly fertile Nile Delta, along a maritime supply route so essential to the city's survival that its interruption, for any reason, threatened the basic order of daily life for hundreds of thousands of people who had never grown a stalk of wheat in their lives and depended entirely on ships they would never see arriving from a province most of them would never visit. Beyond grain, the eastern Mediterranean of the 530s carried on a volume of maritime trade that would not be matched again in the region for centuries. Silk and spices arriving from further east through intermediary ports, olive oil and wine moving between provinces, coin money circulating in quantities that let Justinian's government fund building projects, armies, and diplomatic gifts simultaneously without, for the moment, any sign of fiscal strain. Constantinople's own hippodrome, seating an estimated 100,000 spectators for chariot races that doubled as the empire's single most important venue for popular political expression, ran at a pace and scale that made the city feel, to visitors arriving from smaller provincial towns, like the undisputed center of the civilized world, which, by most practical measures available to a 6th century traveler, it genuinely was. Justinian's ambitions extended well beyond warfare and architecture into the empire's legal foundations as well, and it was during exactly this same confident period that his government produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, a comprehensive codification of Roman law that would go on to shape legal systems across Europe for well over 1,000 years afterward, long past the point at which the empire that had produced it had itself been forgotten by most of the nations still relying, largely unaware, on its legal framework. This was, in short, a government operating at the very peak of its administrative, military, and cultural confidence, reforming its laws, rebuilding its capital, and reconquering lost territory all at once, a rare alignment of ambition and genuine capability that made the catastrophe about to strike it feel, to those who lived through the contrast, almost impossibly cruel in its timing. It was along exactly this route, sometime in the closing months of 541, that something considerably smaller than a soldier, considerably more dangerous than an invading army, began its own journey toward the capital. But before that journey reached its destination, the world it was traveling through had already been quietly weakened by a catastrophe of an entirely different kind. One written not into any chronicle of war or politics, but into the color of the sky itself. Roughly 5 years before the plague's first documented appearance at Pelusium, contemporary observers across an astonishing geographic range, from Byzantine chroniclers to Chinese court records to Mesoamerican tree-ring data recovered by modern scientists, began describing something that had never, in living memory, been recorded before. A sun that gave off light without warmth, a sky that stayed dim through the middle of the day, and a cold that settled over the Mediterranean world in what should have been the height of growing season. The Byzantine historian Procopius, the same eyewitness this account will lean on heavily for the plague itself, described the sun in 536 as giving forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for the better part of a year, a description modern climate scientists now treat not as literary exaggeration but as a startlingly accurate first-hand account of genuine atmospheric conditions. Modern researchers, examining ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica alongside tree-ring records from as far apart as Scandinavia and California, have identified the likely cause. One or more enormous volcanic eruptions, beginning in 536 and compounded by further eruptions in 539 and 540. Throwing enough sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere to measurably dim sunlight across the entire northern hemisphere for years at a stretch. Some climate historians now refer to the period this triggered as the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age, a decades-long cooling event whose opening years, 536 through roughly 540, produced crop failures, unseasonable frosts, and documented famine conditions across regions stretching from Ireland to China, in written accounts that predate the plague's own arrival by several years and describe a suffering entirely independent of it. The connection between this climate catastrophe and the pandemic that followed it remains, deliberately, a matter this account will treat with real caution, since establishing a direct causal chain between 6th century climate data and 6th century epidemiology is difficult, contested scientific territory even with modern tools. But the timing is difficult to entirely set aside, a population across the Mediterranean and Near East already weakened by several consecutive years of poor harvests, unusual cold, and, in some documented regions, outright famine, was considerably less biologically resilient by any reasonable modern understanding of nutrition and immune function than a well-fed population would have been when Yersinia pestis finally arrived at Pelusium in 541. Some historians and epidemiologists studying this period now describe the volcanic winter and the plague that followed it not as two unrelated catastrophes occurring in unfortunate sequence, but as a single compounding disaster, a starved, weakened world meeting history's most efficient killer at almost precisely the worst possible moment it could have arrived. Ireland's own monastic chronicles, written independently of anything happening in the Mediterranean world, record failed harvests specifically in the years 536 and 537, a detail modern researchers find genuinely striking given how far removed early medieval Ireland was from Constantinople both geographically and politically, corroborating, from a source with no conceivable reason to coordinate with Byzantine or Chinese records, that whatever had dimmed the sky in 536 had done so on a genuinely global scale. Chinese court chronicles from the same years described yellow dust falling like snow and summer frost destroying crops, language that, alongside the Irish and Byzantine accounts, has allowed modern climate scientists to reconstruct a genuinely planetary event from scattered, independently written human testimony alone. Decades before any ice core or tree ring data existed to confirm what these worried 6th century chroniclers, on opposite sides of the known world, had each separately taken the trouble to write down. Modern epidemiological detective work, reconstructed centuries later from a combination of ancient DNA evidence and the geographic pattern recorded in contemporary chronicles, traces the outbreak's first documented appearance to the Egyptian port town of Pelusium, near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, in the summer of 541. From there it moved with startling speed to Alexandria, Egypt's great commercial hub, and outward along the shipping lanes that connected Alexandria to virtually every major port in the eastern Mediterranean. The same lanes, running the same routes, carrying the same grain ships that had, for centuries, made Egypt the breadbasket that fed Constantinople's enormous, permanently hungry population. The actual biological chain of transmission, invisible to everyone living through it at the time, is now reasonably well understood. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, occurs naturally in populations of wild rodents, where it typically causes only localized, self-limiting outbreaks. Under the right conditions, and 6th century grain ships, carrying enormous quantities of stored wheat that inevitably attracted rats, provided almost exactly the right conditions. The bacterium can spill over into flea populations living on those rodents, and from infected fleas into the rodent's human neighbors, whether through a flea bite directly or, in its most severe pneumonic form, through direct person-to-person transmission via respiratory droplets once the disease had established itself in a dense human population. Ships, dense with grain, dense with rats, and traveling directly between two of the era's most crowded cities, functioned as close to a perfect delivery mechanism as the ancient world could have accidentally engineered. None of this was remotely understood by anyone alive in 541. Contemporary observers had no concept of bacteria, no concept of fleas as disease vectors, and reached instead for the explanatory frameworks available to them: divine punishment, cosmic imbalance, poisoned air rising from the earth itself, a theory of disease transmission called miasma theory that would dominate Western medical thinking for well over 1,000 years after this outbreak, right up through the Black Death and considerably beyond it. What contemporaries could observe, with growing alarm, was the pattern: a sickness moving along the coastline with the same speed and the same routes as their own merchant ships, arriving in port after port within weeks of a vessel's docking, as though the disease itself were traveling as cargo, which, in the most literal sense available to 6th century observers, it effectively was. Egypt itself, the plague's point of origin within the empire, suffered some of the outbreak's earliest and most severe mortality, a detail later chapters of this account will need to hold in mind. Since Egypt's role as Constantinople's primary grain supplier meant that a province simultaneously losing an enormous share of its own population was also expected to keep feeding a capital city hundreds of miles away that depended on it completely. Alexandria, second only to Constantinople itself in size and importance within the Eastern Empire, reported mortality severe enough that contemporary Egyptian sources describe entire neighborhoods falling silent within a matter of weeks, an early, localized preview of exactly the citywide collapse Constantinople itself would soon experience on a still larger scale. Once the same sickness that had already emptied Pelusium's harbor completed its short voyage north across open water. The rat itself, the animal modern science identifies as the plague's principal carrier in this period, was, by the 6th century, already a well-established fixture of Mediterranean maritime life, having spread throughout the region centuries earlier alongside the same trade networks that carried grain, wine, and other goods between ports. Black rats in particular, the species most closely associated with this ancient outbreak, thrive in exactly the kind of enclosed, grain-filled ship holds that Egyptian grain vessels provided in abundance, and the fleas living on those rats required nothing more than the ordinary, unremarkable process of loading and unloading cargo to make the jump from an infested ship to a bustling harbor district, and from there into the granaries, marketplaces, and crowded housing of whatever city that ship happened to call home. By early 542, the sickness that had emptied Pelusium and ravaged Alexandria reached Constantinople itself, carried, almost certainly, aboard one of the grain ships that arrived in the capital's harbor with the same predictable regularity they always had, their holds full of the wheat that kept the city fed, and, this time, carrying something considerably less welcome alongside it. The city did not immediately grasp what was arriving. Early cases, scattered and initially unremarkable against the ordinary background noise of illness in a city of 500,000 people, gave little warning of what was building toward it. The pattern that contemporary sources described would become horribly familiar to later generations studying subsequent plague outbreaks, though nobody in Constantinople in early 542 had that later knowledge to draw on. Victims developed sudden fever, and within days, painful swellings, buboes, and the terminology later medical writers would use, appeared in the groin, the armpits, or behind the ears, the lymph nodes nearest the site of an infected flea's bite swelling as the body's immune system attempted, usually in vain, to contain a bacterium it had no evolved defense against. Some victims lapsed into a kind of stupor within days of the fever's onset, others experienced the opposite, a violent delirium that contemporary accounts described with genuine horror, as afflicted individuals were, in some recorded cases, restrained by household members or caretakers to prevent them from harming themselves or others during the disease's final, agonizing stages. Mortality, once symptoms had fully progressed, was severe. Modern estimates for untreated bubonic plague generally place fatality somewhere in the range of 30 to 60%, though the 6th century outbreak's true case fatality rate cannot be reconstructed with precision from the sources available, since no one in Constantinople was keeping the kind of systematic clinical records a modern epidemiologist would need. What the city's residents could observe directly, without any need for statistics, was simpler and considerably more alarming. Their neighbors were falling sick in growing numbers. An increasing share of them were dying within a matter of days, and whatever explanation the imperial physicians of Constantinople could offer for what was happening to their city, none of it amounted to anything resembling a cure. The physicians of 6th century Constantinople were not, it should be said, unskilled or unserious practitioners by the standards of their era. Byzantine medicine drew on a genuine, centuries-deep inheritance from Hippocratic and Galenic tradition, and the city maintained hospitals, trained doctors, and a body of accumulated medical literature considerably more sophisticated than the popular modern image of medieval medicine tends to suggest. None of that inheritance, however, included any concept of a bacterial pathogen, any understanding of insect-borne transmission, or any treatment beyond the era's standard tools of bloodletting, herbal remedies, and the lancing of buboes themselves, a genuinely dangerous intervention that, absent any concept of infection control, likely did considerably more harm than good in a meaningful share of cases, however well-intentioned the physicians attempting it actually were. Some 6th century physicians did make genuinely careful clinical observations that, read with modern hindsight, come remarkably close to an accurate description of the disease's actual progression, even without any theoretical framework to explain what they were seeing. A few surviving medical texts from the period note that patients who developed visibly suppurating, draining buboes seemed, anecdotally, more likely to survive than those whose swellings remained hard and unbroken, an observation that aligns reasonably well with modern medical understanding of how the body's immune response to bubonic plague actually functions, even though the physicians recording it had no possible way of understanding the underlying biological mechanism and would have had no way to reliably induce that outcome in a patient whose swelling had not broken on its own regardless. Almost everything historians know about how this outbreak actually unfolded inside Constantinople comes from a single, extraordinary eyewitness, Procopius of Caesarea, Justinian's own court historian, who happened to be living in the capital during the plague's worst months and left behind, in his history of the wars, one of the most detailed first-hand descriptions of an epidemic to survive from the entire ancient world. Procopius was, by training and temperament, a careful observer rather than a physician, and his account reflects that, less a clinical case study than the record of an intelligent, deeply unsettled contemporary trying to make sense of something that defied every explanatory framework available to him. Procopius described the disease's progression in considerable, almost forensic detail, the sudden onset of fever, indistinguishable at first from countless milder illnesses, the appearance of the characteristic swellings, which he specifically located in the groin, armpit, and beside the ears, and the disease's genuinely unpredictable course from that point forward, with some victims recovering against seemingly hopeless odds while others exhibiting what appeared to observers as identical symptoms, died within hours. He noted, with the puzzlement of someone documenting a pattern he could see but could not explain, that the disease seemed to make no particular distinction between rich and poor, young and old, though he also recorded that some households were struck with what felt like supernatural precision while immediately neighboring homes remained entirely untouched, an observation modern epidemiologists would likely attribute to the localized, somewhat random nature of flea-borne transmission, but which offered 6th century Constantinople no comfort and no pattern it could meaningfully act on. Procopius's account matters enormously to modern historians for a reason worth stating plainly. It is essentially the only sustained, detailed contemporary narrative of the plague's course inside the capital that survives at all. Other sources, regional chronicles, later Byzantine historians drawing on now-lost records, scattered references in the letters and writings of contemporary churchmen, corroborate the outbreak's broad shape and its staggering toll, but it is Procopius, watching from inside the city itself, who gives this account its human texture, the fear, the confusion, and the genuine helplessness of watching a catastrophe unfold with no available explanation and, worse, no available remedy. Procopius was, by his own later admission and other writings, a deeply ambivalent chronicler of Justinian's reign, capable, in his history of the wars, of describing the emperor's building projects and military campaigns with real, if sometimes qualified, admiration, while reserving, for a separate and considerably more scathing manuscript he apparently never intended for public circulation during his own lifetime, an altogether harsher verdict on Justinian's character and rule. That second work, the secret history, remained unknown to the wider world for nearly a millennium after Procopius's death, rediscovered only in the Vatican Library in the 17th century. And it is worth knowing this about its author before this account leans on it further in later chapters. Procopius the plague chronicler and Procopius the bitter court critic were, unmistakably, the same restless, complicated observer, and reading either of his surviving works in isolation risks missing exactly how much personal disappointment, ambition, and disillusionment shaped the version of events he chose, in each case, to leave behind for later centuries to find. Procopius was not, in fact, the only contemporary to leave behind a first-hand account of the plague's course, though his has become, by a wide margin, the version most frequently retold. A second, independent eyewitness, a Syriac-speaking churchman named John of Ephesus, recorded his own experience of the outbreak in an ecclesiastical history written from a considerably different vantage point, not Justinian's glittering court, but the perspective of a working bishop who had, by his own account, personally traveled through plague-stricken towns in Syria and Asia Minor at the height of the catastrophe. John's account, surviving today only in fragments and later quotations preserved by subsequent Syriac chroniclers, offers historians something Procopius's more polished, literary narrative does not: a raw, at times almost unbearably immediate description of ordinary provincial communities collapsing under the same catastrophe striking the capital simultaneously. John described traveling through towns where the sick lay uncared for because every possible caretaker had already fallen ill themselves, and recorded, with an eye for logistical detail Procopius's more literary account tends to pass over, the sheer practical impossibility that overwhelmed communities faced in trying to bury their dead according to any normal religious rite once mortality reached the levels the plague was producing. Where Procopius wrote as a court historian processing an unprecedented catastrophe striking the empire's greatest city, John of Ephesus wrote as a churchman personally moving through the wreckage of smaller communities that left behind no comparable literary record of their own, communities whose suffering would otherwise have vanished from history almost entirely, were it not for one traveling bishop's decision to write down what he had personally witnessed along the road. Historians treat the convergence between these two genuinely independent sources, a Greek writing court historian in Constantinople and a Syriac writing bishop traveling through the provinces, as some of the strongest available evidence that the catastrophe both men described was neither exaggerated court rhetoric nor a localized capital city crisis, but a genuinely empire-wide disaster witnessed, described, and mourned by observers who had no reason to coordinate their accounts and, in John's case, wrote for an audience that had almost certainly never read a word Procopius had written. John's own theological tradition, non-Chalcedonian Christianity, existed in genuine tension with the officially favored Chalcedonian doctrine of Justinian's own court, a doctrinal divide this account will not attempt to untangle in any detail, but worth noting because it makes John's testimony about the plague all the more valuable to modern historians. He had little institutional reason to flatter Constantinople's official narrative of events, and his account, considerably more theologically independent of the imperial court than Procopius's own, reads as an unusually unfiltered record from a churchman who owed the reigning emperor no particular loyalty and had no career reason to soften what he had personally witnessed on the roads of Syria and Asia Minor. At its peak, by Procopius's own account, the death toll inside Constantinople reached a scale that modern historians treat with appropriate caution. He records a figure of as many as 10,000 deaths in a single day at the outbreak's worst point, a number many scholars now regard as an approximation reflecting genuine catastrophe rather than a precise census. since no functioning administrative system in the ancient world could have produced an exact daily count under those conditions. Whatever the true peak figure, the scale was, by any measure, staggering, and the city's ordinary infrastructure for handling death simply could not keep pace with it. Constantinople's existing cemeteries filled within days. The city's normal burial customs, individual graves, funeral rites conducted by family and clergy, the ordinary dignities a late antique Mediterranean city extended to its dead, collapsed under a volume of bodies no pre-modern urban infrastructure had ever been designed to absorb. Authorities, faced with an accumulating crisis that threatened public health quite apart from the plague itself, ordered vast pits dug outside the city's fortifications, across the Golden Horn in the district known as Psyche, where the dead were laid in mass graves that historical accounts describe as reaching a depth and scale without precedent in the city's history. When even those pits proved insufficient for the volume arriving daily, the roofs were stripped from the towers of a nearby fortification, and bodies were lowered into the resulting open shafts until, according to Procopius, the stench eventually made the surrounding area nearly unbearable to approach. Ships that would ordinarily have carried grain or goods were, for a period, repurposed for a considerably grimmer cargo, ferrying bodies out into open water when land-based burial capacity had been entirely exhausted, a measure of last resort that speaks, more clearly than any single statistic could, to just how completely the catastrophe had overwhelmed every ordinary mechanism a great ancient city possessed for managing its own dead. Normal civic life did not so much slow as partially cease. Shops closed. Public officials, craftsmen, and laborers fell sick or fled the city outright, and Procopius records that even routine tasks, baking bread, tending the sick, burying the recently dead, became genuinely difficult to accomplish, since the very people who would ordinarily have performed them were themselves sick, dying, or already gone. Constantinople, the largest and most fortified city in the known world, had, for a period of weeks, come close to simply stopping. Justinian, still healthy at this point in the outbreak, responded to the burial crisis with the same administrative energy that had characterized his building projects and legal reforms in calmer years, appointing a court official named Theodore specifically to oversee the emergency and directing considerable public funds toward the mass grave operations across the Golden Horn, a genuine, if grimly limited, act of crisis governance, and won Procopius records with something closer to approval than the sharper criticism he would later level at the emperor's handling of the plague's fiscal aftermath. It was not enough, and could not have been enough, given the sheer scale of what the city was experiencing, but it stands as a reminder that the imperial government did not simply watch the catastrophe unfold without attempting to respond. Even an administration as sophisticated as 6th century Byzantium's had virtually no historical precedent to draw on for managing mortality on the scale Constantinople was now experiencing week after week. The Hippodrome itself, the beating heart of Constantinople's public life and the venue where the emperor's own popularity was most visibly measured through the roaring approval or displeasure of its packed crowds, fell silent during the outbreak's worst weeks, chariot races suspended, the enormous venue that could ordinarily hold 100,000 spectators standing empty. A detail contemporary observers noted with a kind of specific, symbolic dread, since a city that could not safely gather. For its most beloved public entertainment had, by its own cultural standards, unmistakably stopped functioning as itself. Amid this collapse, the plague reached even the one man theoretically most insulated from it. Sometime in 542, Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease, a detail Procopius records with evident significance. Since an emperor's illness in a state without any clearly established succession mechanism represented a crisis considerably larger than one man's personal suffering, however serious that suffering genuinely was. Justinian had, by this point in his reign, spent over a decade consolidating enormous personal authority, and the prospect of his sudden death, with no adult son and no clearly designated heir, threatened to plunge an empire already reeling from epidemic catastrophe into a succession crisis layered directly on top of it. The uncertainty surrounding Justinian's illness produced exactly the kind of anxious political maneuvering such moments tend to generate. Procopius records, in his considerably more critical later work known as The Secret History, that some of the emperor's own generals, including, by some accounts, Belisarius himself, fighting far away in Italy at the time, were rumored to have discussed, in the event of Justinian's death, whether they would accept whatever successor the court in Constantinople might choose, or act independently instead. Whether these particular rumors reflected genuine disloyalty or simply the ordinary, understandable contingency planning any responsible commander might undertake when his emperor appeared to be dying of an epidemic disease with no cure, historians continue to debate. What is not in dispute is that Justinian's recovery, against the odds that had genuinely seemed poor, diffused a succession crisis that had come uncomfortably close to actually materializing. Empress Theodora, remarkably, appears in the surviving record to have remained healthy throughout this period and to have continued exercising real governing authority while her husband lay incapacitated. A detail that aligns with the broader picture modern historians have pieced together of Theodora as a genuinely consequential political actor throughout Justinian's reign, rather than merely a ceremonial consort. Justinian did recover, eventually, though the illness left him, by some later accounts, visibly changed, a survivor of a catastrophe that had killed an enormous share of his own capital's population, ruling over an empire that would spend decades absorbing the consequences of an epidemic its emperor himself had personally, and very nearly fatally, experienced. The precise nature of Justinian's illness cannot be reconstructed with full medical certainty from the surviving sources, which describe symptoms consistent with the plague generally without offering the kind of detailed clinical description Procopius reserved for the broader outbreak's presentation in the population at large. What the sources agree on is the timeline: an emperor incapacitated for a genuinely dangerous stretch of time, at the exact moment his empire could least afford a vacuum at its center, and a recovery that Byzantine court culture, ever attentive to signs of divine favor, was quick to frame as evidence that Justinian's rule carried a legitimacy the plague itself, for all its indiscriminate reach through every other level of society, had ultimately declined to touch. Theodora's own biography makes her steady presence during this crisis considerably less surprising than it might first appear. She had risen to the imperial throne from a background contemporary sources describe, with evident scorn, as involving the theater and, by some accounts, considerably less respectable work still. An origin so far beneath conventional expectations for an empress that Justinian had needed to alter Roman law itself, which had previously barred senators from marrying former actresses, simply to make their marriage legally possible in the first place. A woman who had already navigated that kind of social distance to reach the throne, and who had, by 542, spent well over a decade exercising real influence over imperial policy, including a well-documented, decisive role in personally persuading Justinian not to flee the city during the earlier Nika riots, was, in temperament and political experience alike, about as well prepared as anyone in the empire could have been to hold the government steady while its emperor lay incapacitated. An epidemic of this scale does not confine its damage to the sick and the dying. It reaches into every mechanism an ancient state relied on to actually function, and the Byzantine administrative apparatus, sophisticated as it was by the standards of its era, proved no exception. Tax collection, the fiscal lifeblood of any pre-modern empire, depended on a functioning bureaucracy of local officials, scribes, and tax farmers moving through provincial towns and cities on a predictable schedule, a system that simply could not operate normally when a meaningful share of the officials responsible for running it were themselves sick, dead, or fled from their posts entirely. Grain distribution, the system that kept Constantinople's enormous population fed on a daily basis, faced its own version of the same problem from multiple directions at once. Fewer farmers alive in Egypt to plant and harvest the wheat the capital depended on, fewer sailors healthy enough to crew the ships that carried it, and fewer dock workers and administrators in Constantinople itself able to receive, store, and distribute grain once it actually arrived. Contemporary sources describe genuine food shortages compounding the epidemic's direct toll during its worst months, a secondary crisis stacked directly on top of the primary one, striking a population already weakened by disease, fear, and the sheer psychological exhaustion of watching a familiar city become, within a matter of weeks, almost unrecognizable. Justinian's government, according to Procopius's more critical secret history account, did not always respond to this collapse with what modern readers might consider appropriate flexibility. Procopius specifically accuses the emperor of continuing to demand full tax payments from regions and communities that had lost enormous portions of their taxable population to the plague, effectively requiring survivors to cover the fiscal obligations of neighbors who were no longer alive to pay their own share. An accusation historians treat with some caution given Procopius's well-documented personal animus toward Justinian in that particular later work, but one that, whether taken at full face value or read more skeptically, reflects the genuine fiscal bind an empire hemorrhaging both population and revenue simultaneously found itself trapped inside, with no historical precedent available to guide its response. Legal record-keeping itself offers a quieter, less dramatic but genuinely telling window into this administrative strain. Surviving Byzantine legal texts from the years immediately following the outbreak show Justinian's government issuing new legislation specifically addressing inheritance disputes arising when entire families died in quick succession, leaving unclear or contested claims to property and titles that existing law had never been designed to untangle at this scale. Novel 84, one such piece of surviving legislation, addresses precisely this problem, and its existence tells modern historians something the more dramatic burial pit accounts cannot: that the plague's disruption reached deep into the routine, unglamorous machinery of law and inheritance that an ancient state needed functioning smoothly simply to keep property, contracts, and family succession from collapsing into chaos alongside everything else. Coinage itself offers modern economic historians a further, unexpectedly revealing thread to pull on. Numismatic analysis of surviving 6th century Byzantine gold and copper coins shows measurable changes in minting volume and, in some interpretations, in metal content across the plague-affected years, consistent with the state managing a genuine fiscal contraction even as it continued, out of sheer necessity, to pay soldiers, officials, and the enormous ongoing costs of Justinian's building and military programs. None of this evidence, examined in isolation, would tell a dramatic story on its own: a slightly reduced coin volume here, an adjusted inheritance law there, But taken together with the burial pits and the silenced hippodrome this account has already described, it completes a considerably fuller picture of an empire-absorbing catastrophe, not in one single visible collapse, but in dozens of smaller, interlocking administrative strains, each one manageable individually, each one considerably harder to manage all at once. Constantinople's suffering, catastrophic as it was, represented only the most thoroughly documented chapter of a considerably larger catastrophe. The same maritime trade networks that had carried the plague from Pelusium to Alexandria to the imperial capital continued carrying it outward from Constantinople and every direction those networks reached, and in the 6th century Mediterranean, that meant nearly everywhere. Within roughly 2 years of its first appearance in Egypt, contemporary and near-contemporary sources placed the plague in Italy, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, a geographic spread that modern historians sometimes describe, without exaggeration, as reaching across 3 continents inside a genuinely narrow window of time. The mechanism of spread mirrored what had already happened along the Egypt to Constantinople route: merchant ships, carrying rats, carrying fleas, carrying the bacterium itself, moved along established Mediterranean shipping lanes that had, for centuries, connected the ancient world's major ports into a single interconnected commercial network. Precisely the kind of network that makes for tremendously efficient trade, and, as the 6th century discovered with brutal clarity, tremendously efficient disease transmission as well. Coastal cities, more thoroughly integrated into this maritime network than inland settlements, generally suffered first and often most severely, while the diseases advance inland tended to follow major rivers and overland trade roads, arriving somewhat later and, in some documented cases, with somewhat reduced intensity, though by no means everywhere, and by no means predictably. Gregory of Tours, a bishop and historian writing from Frankish Gaul rather than the Byzantine world Procopius knew, left behind his own independent account of plague outbreaks striking cities across what is now France, offering historians a crucial second vantage point on a catastrophe that clearly was not confined to the eastern Mediterranean Procopius personally witnessed. Together, these scattered but corroborating regional accounts allow modern historians to reconstruct, in broad outline if not precise detail, a pandemic that had, within an astonishingly short span of time, become genuinely continental in reach, a single outbreak from a single Egyptian port town somehow finding its way to nearly every corner of the late antique Mediterranean world. North Africa, only recently reconquered by Belisarius from Vandal rule and still absorbing the administrative and social upheaval of that reconquest, was struck by the plague within this same rapid 2-year window as well, according to surviving regional sources, a further, particularly cruel irony for a province that had barely finished adjusting to renewed Byzantine governance before finding itself facing an entirely unrelated catastrophe arriving, quite literally, on the next ship in from the eastern Mediterranean. Spain's Visigothic kingdom, and the Frankish territories further north that Gregory of Tours would later document, received the plague somewhat later than the Mediterranean's core trading hub cities, consistent with the broader pattern of coastal, well-connected regions suffering first while more peripheral, less thoroughly integrated territories experienced a delayed, though rarely much diminished, version of the same catastrophe once local trade and travel eventually carried it there. Constantinople's suffering has dominated this account so far for the same reason it dominates the surviving sources. Procopius lived there, and his account is simply the most detailed narrative that has come down to the present day. But the plague's true human weight fell overwhelmingly on people who left behind no written record at all: the farmers of rural Anatolia, the dockworkers of secondary ports like Antioch and Ephesus, the shepherds of upland Syria, whose deaths registered, if they registered anywhere in the surviving historical record, only as an aggregate drop in a tax register or a passing mention in someone else's chronicle rather than as individually documented tragedy. Antioch, one of the eastern Mediterranean's other great cities and already a place that had suffered a devastating earthquake barely a decade earlier, was struck by the plague with a severity contemporary sources describe as fully comparable to Constantinople's own experience, compounding a city already reeling from one catastrophe with a second, entirely unrelated one within the span of a single generation. Smaller towns across Syria, Palestine, and Asia Minor, considerably less equipped than the imperial capital to organize mass burial efforts or maintain any semblance of civic administration through a crisis of this scale, appear in the fragmentary sources that do survive as places where the plague's disruption to ordinary religious, agricultural, and economic life proved, if anything, more total and more immediate than in Constantinople, precisely because these smaller communities possessed none of the capital's comparatively vast administrative and logistical resources to draw on. It is worth sitting with this asymmetry in the record for a moment, because it shapes how this entire pandemic gets remembered even now. The version of this story that survives in the greatest detail is, almost by definition, the version experienced by the empire's most literate, most politically connected population, court officials, churchmen, and the historians who wrote for them, while the considerably larger population of ordinary provincial farmers and townspeople who bore, in raw numerical terms, the greater share of the plague's total mortality left behind names, for the most part, that no historian will ever be able to recover. Archaeology has, in recent decades, begun to partially close this gap in ways written chronicles never could. Excavations at rural settlement sites across the eastern Mediterranean have identified apparent settlement contraction and, in some cases, outright abandonment dating to roughly this period. Physical evidence of demographic disruption that requires no literate chronicler to have survived in order for modern researchers to detect it. These excavated sites will never yield individual names or personal stories the way Procopius's court-centered narrative does, but they offer something else of genuine value: independent, physical confirmation that the plague's rural toll, so thinly documented in the written record, left behind a real and measurable footprint in the ground itself for archaeologists patient enough, centuries later, to go looking for it. It would be a mistake, and a genuinely significant one, to tell this story purely as a Byzantine tragedy, because the plague did not respect the 6th century's political boundaries any more than it respected social class, and Byzantium's great imperial rival, the Sasanian Empire ruling from Persia, suffered its own version of the same catastrophe. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources, including Syriac chronicles written within Sasanian territory itself, describe outbreaks striking Persian cities with a severity that, while less thoroughly documented than Procopius's account of Constantinople, appears to have been broadly comparable in scale and consequence. This detail matters enormously for understanding what the plague actually did to the balance of power in the ancient world, because Byzantium and Persia were not distant, unconnected civilizations experiencing parallel but separate misfortunes. They were the two great superpowers of the late antique Middle East, locked in a rivalry, punctuated by periodic open warfare, that had already run for centuries by the time the plague arrived and would continue running for decades afterward. A catastrophe that weakened only one side of that rivalry might have produced a decisive, lasting shift in the regional balance of power. A catastrophe that weakened both roughly in parallel instead functioned as something closer to a shared, exhausting drain on both empires simultaneously. A kind of grim historical leveling that left neither Constantinople nor the Sasanian capital at Ctesiphon in a meaningfully stronger position relative to the other once the worst of the initial outbreak had passed. Some historians have described this dynamic, only somewhat informally, as the plague acting as a kind of great equalizer across the 6th century Middle East, not sparing either great power, and in doing so, arguably preserving the existing balance between them for a while longer than either empire's own military and political decisions alone might otherwise have produced. Whether that framing overstates a genuinely complex dynamic is a question this account will return to later, once it has traced the plague's full arc through both empires across the following 2 centuries. But the basic fact of Persia's own severe outbreak deserves to be stated clearly here. This was never only a Byzantine catastrophe, and treating it as one, as popular retellings sometimes do, considerably understates just how far-reaching this pandemic's true footprint actually was. The Sasanian king Khosrow I, who ruled through this same period and is remembered by later Persian tradition as one of the dynasty's most capable and reform-minded monarchs, presided over an empire that, much like Byzantium, had to absorb this demographic shock while continuing to manage an extensive administrative apparatus, a professional standing army, and an ongoing rivalry with Constantinople that neither side's own internal catastrophe proved sufficient to fully interrupt. Persian sources from this period are, if anything, thinner than the Byzantine record for the plague specifically, filtered largely through later Islamic-era historians writing well after the Sasanian Empire's own eventual fall, a further, separate reminder, alongside the provincial silences this account has already noted, of how unevenly ancient catastrophes survive into the historical record depending entirely on which side of a given rivalry happened to produce the chroniclers later. Centuries would preserve. To understand exactly what the plague interrupted when it reached Italy, it helps to step back briefly and consider who Belisarius actually was, and what he had already achieved by the time the outbreak's consequences began reshaping his war. Belisarius rose from relatively modest origins to become, by his 30s, Justinian's most trusted and most consistently successful general. A reputation built first in a hard-fought but ultimately indecisive war against Sasanian Persia along the empire's eastern frontier, and cemented considerably more dramatically in 533, when he led a Byzantine expeditionary force across the Mediterranean and destroyed the Vandal kingdom that had controlled North Africa for roughly a century in a campaign so swift and so complete that it startled observers across the Mediterranean world. That North African triumph gave Justinian's broader Reconquest ambition its first genuine proof of concept, and Belisarius carried that momentum directly into Italy beginning in 535, landing in Sicily and pushing north against Ostrogothic resistance with an initial run of successes, including the capture of Naples and, in 536, Rome itself, that made final victory feel, for a brief window of years, like a matter of time rather than genuine doubt. By 540, Belisarius had captured the Ostrogothic capital at Ravenna and, in a moment later chroniclers found nearly as remarkable as the military victory itself, was offered the crown of a rival Western Roman Empire by the defeated Goths themselves, an offer the ever-loyal general refused, choosing instead to return in apparent triumph to Constantinople with the captured Ostrogothic king in tow. It was this Belisarius, at the height of his reputation and his career, whose war effort the plague arrived to complicate, beginning barely a year after his triumphant return from Italy, and the general who would be recalled to the Italian theater in the years that followed found conditions, resources, and imperial attention considerably diminished from the confident, well-resourced campaign he had waged only a few years earlier. Belisarius's own wife, Antonina, deserves at least brief mention here as well, since she traveled with her husband on several of his major campaigns and appears in Procopius's writing, particularly the more critical Secret History, as a genuinely significant figure in her own right, closely tied to Empress Theodora's inner court circle, and, according to Procopius's considerably less flattering account, a woman whose personal and political entanglements at court occasionally complicated her husband's already difficult position as a general whose enormous popularity made him, in the eyes of a notoriously suspicious emperor, a potential rival as much as an asset. That undercurrent of imperial suspicion toward his own most successful general would follow Belisarius for the remainder of his career, adding a further layer of political complication to a war effort the plague had already made considerably harder to win outright. While the plague was reshaping Constantinople and spreading outward across the Mediterranean and into Persia, Justinian's ambitious military campaign to reclaim Italy from Ostrogothic rule was still very much underway, led in the field by the same general, Belisarius, whose earlier reconquest of North Africa had made him one of the most celebrated commanders of the era. The plague's arrival did not spare this campaign, and its effects on the war's trajectory, while harder to isolate with precision than its direct death toll in Constantinople, appear in the historical record clearly enough for modern historians to treat as a genuinely significant contributing factor to how the conflict subsequently unfolded. Military campaigns of this era depended on steady flows of recruits, supplies, and, perhaps most critically for a war effort already straining Byzantine finances, tax revenue collected from a population that could actually afford to pay it. All three of these supply lines suffered directly from the epidemic's broader economic and demographic disruption, and Belisarius, along with the commanders who eventually succeeded him in the Italian theater, found themselves waging an already difficult war of attrition against determined Ostrogothic resistance with steadily thinning resources, arriving from an imperial center that was simultaneously trying to recover from its own catastrophic losses and fund the war at the same time. The Gothic War in Italy, which many contemporaries had expected, in its earlier and more triumphant phase, to conclude in a matter of a few additional years, instead dragged on for nearly 2 decades total, not concluding until 554, a protracted, exhausting conflict that devastated the Italian peninsula itself nearly as thoroughly as the plague had devastated the empire trying to reconquer it. Historians debate how much of this extended timeline can be attributed to the plague specifically, as opposed to the ordinary difficulties of 6th century siege warfare, determined Gothic leadership under commanders like Totila, and the sheer logistical challenge of projecting Byzantine military power across the full length of the Italian peninsula from a capital hundreds of miles away. But few dispute that an empire not simultaneously absorbing a catastrophic population and revenue loss would have been considerably better positioned to press its early advantage in Italy toward a faster, more decisive conclusion than the one it eventually, exhaustedly, achieved. Italy itself paid perhaps the highest price of any theater in this drawn-out conflict, since the peninsula that Justinian's armies were nominally liberating from Ostrogothic rule instead endured nearly 2 decades of recurring siege warfare, scorched earth tactics from both sides, and its own share of the plague's direct mortality, layered on top of one another in a combination later Italian chroniclers would describe as leaving parts of the countryside genuinely depopulated. Rome itself changed hands multiple times across the war's later years, its population, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands at the height of the classical empire, reduced by some later estimates to a small fraction of that figure by the war's eventual end in 554, a reconquest that had been intended, and Justinian's own stated ambition, to restore Roman glory to the city that had once anchored the entire empire, and that instead left that same city smaller, poorer, and more thoroughly ruined than it had been in generations. No question surrounding this pandemic generates more genuine scholarly disagreement than the simple one of how many people it actually killed. And this account owes you an honest look at that disagreement rather than a single confident number, because the confident numbers that do circulate rest on considerably shakier ground than they're often presented as resting on. Older generations of historians, working primarily from Procopius's own dramatic figures and broadly comparable estimates for the Black Death's later, better documented toll, produced estimates suggesting the Justinianic plague may have killed somewhere between a quarter and half of the population across the affected regions of the Mediterranean world, a staggering range that, if accurate at even its lower bound, would represent one of the deadliest events in recorded human history relative to the total population alive at the time. More recent scholarship has pushed back against these older estimates with genuine force, and this pushback deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as revisionist contrarianism. A body of research published over the past decade or so, drawing on archaeological evidence, close rereading of contemporary sources, and comparative demographic modeling, has argued that the older catastrophic estimates rest too heavily on Procopius's own admittedly dramatic, and possibly rhetorically inflated, figures for Constantinople specifically, and that evidence for comparably severe mortality across the broader countryside, where the overwhelming majority of the ancient Mediterranean's population actually lived, remains considerably thinner and more ambiguous than the urban, elite-authored sources that survive would suggest on their own. This account will not pretend to resolve a genuine, ongoing academic debate that working historians themselves have not resolved, and any version of this story that hands you a single precise mortality percentage with total confidence is, frankly, offering you more certainty than the actual evidence currently supports. What can be said with reasonable confidence, sitting between these competing scholarly positions, is this: contemporary observers across multiple independent regions, writing without any coordination with one another, described a catastrophe of genuinely extraordinary scale, one severe enough to overwhelm existing burial infrastructure, disrupt tax collection, and interrupt a major ongoing war, evidence of real, substantial demographic damage, even if its precise numerical scale, whether closer to Procopius's dramatic figures or to the more conservative revisionist estimates, remains, and may always remain, genuinely uncertain. This ongoing scholarly disagreement is, in its own way, a genuinely healthy sign of how historical science actually works, rather than a reason to distrust the field's conclusions altogether. The revisionist historians challenging the older catastrophic estimates are not claiming the plague was a minor event. They are arguing, more precisely, that its severity likely varied considerably by region, that Constantinople's own experience may not generalize cleanly to the empire's vast rural hinterland, and that the surviving written sources, produced almost entirely by an urban, literate elite, may systematically overrepresent the catastrophe's urban dimension relative to its rural one. That is a genuinely different claim from denying the plague's severity outright, and this account has tried, throughout, to represent that more careful, more contested version of the evidence rather than reaching for whichever number happens to make for the most dramatic single sentence. Comparative context helps here as well. The Black Death, striking a considerably better documented 14th century Europe, is generally estimated by modern historians to have killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the affected regional population within its initial multi-year wave, a range historians feel reasonably confident about specifically because Europe's denser documentary record, including tax rolls, parish records, and manorial accounts, allows for considerably more rigorous demographic reconstruction than anything the 6th century Mediterranean world left behind. The Justinianic plague's true toll, whatever its precise figure, unfolded within a documentary environment that simply cannot support the same level of confident precision, not because the underlying catastrophe was necessarily smaller, but because the tools available for measuring it, then and now, are considerably less complete. One further comparison worth holding onto, the 1918 influenza pandemic, occurring within living memory and considerably better documented than either historical plague, is estimated to have killed somewhere in the range of 1 to 3% of the entire global population within roughly a single year. And even that far more precisely measured modern catastrophe still carries genuine, ongoing uncertainty in its exact global death toll, with historians' estimates spanning a range of tens of millions of people despite the existence of 20th century record-keeping, telegraphs, and newspapers in a way the 6th century Mediterranean world could not remotely match. If a pandemic occurring within living memory of people alive today still resists precise quantification, the genuine difficulty of pinning an exact number on a catastrophe 15 centuries removed from any comparable record keeping should come as no particular surprise, however unsatisfying that uncertainty may feel to a mind that would simply prefer a clean, memorable statistic. Whatever its precise numerical toll, the plague's practical consequences for the Byzantine state proved durable in ways that went well beyond the immediate crisis of 542. A smaller population meant, quite directly, a smaller tax base, and an empire already straining to fund an ambitious multi-front military strategy found that strategy considerably harder to sustain once a significant share of its tax-paying subjects were no longer alive to be taxed. Military recruitment faced a comparable squeeze, fewer young men surviving to fighting age across the affected decades meant a shrinking pool of potential soldiers for an empire that, even before the plague, had relied heavily on a mix of citizen levies and increasingly expensive professional and mercenary troops to fill its armies. Agricultural production, the actual economic foundation everything else depended on, suffered its own version of the same demographic squeeze. Fields that had been cultivated for generations went, in some documented regions, partially untended as the labor available to work them declined. And while the empire's core grain-producing regions in Egypt eventually recovered enough productive capacity to continue feeding Constantinople, the broader agricultural economy across the plague-affected Mediterranean took considerably longer to return to anything resembling its pre-541 output. Some modern economic historians have pointed to this period as marking a genuine inflection point in the broader late antique Mediterranean economy, not a single catastrophic collapse, since the Byzantine state plainly continued functioning, fighting wars, and building monuments for centuries afterward, but a durable downward adjustment in the underlying economic base that had supported Justinian's ambitious Reconquest project in the first place. Justinian himself continued ruling for more than 2 decades after his own recovery from the disease, dying finally in 565, having lived to see both the qualified triumph of his Italian reconquest and the mounting, harder to reverse costs that same triumph, and the plague that had struck in the middle of pursuing it, had left behind for his successors to manage. The empire he handed to his nephew and successor Justin II was, in territorial terms, considerably larger than the one he had inherited from his own uncle decades earlier, but it was also, in ways contemporary observers could sense even if they lacked the demographic tools to measure it precisely, a state that had spent its final and most productive years of expansion absorbing a wound that would keep draining its strength, gradually and almost imperceptibly, for generations still to come. Justin II himself, inheriting this weakened foundation in 565, found the gap between Justinian's territorial ambitions and the empire's actual remaining capacity to defend them almost immediately as new pressures, a resurgent Persian frontier, and the arrival of the Lombards, a new Germanic people who overran much of the Italian peninsula. Belisarius and his successors had fought so long and so expensively to reclaim, began eroding Justinian's hard-won gains within barely a few years of his death. The Reconquest that had defined Justinian's reign, and that the plague had done so much to complicate in its execution, proved, in the end, considerably less durable than its architect had hoped. A monument to ambition that outlived its builder by barely a generation before large portions of it began slipping away again. Justinian's own reputation among later historians has, accordingly, remained genuinely divided in a way that traces directly back to this same tension between ambition and circumstance. Some traditions remember him primarily as one of Byzantium's greatest builders and codifiers, the emperor whose Hagia Sophia and legal code outlasted his empire's own political boundaries by well over a millennium. Others, drawing more heavily on Procopius's unpublished secret history, remember a ruler whose reconquest ambitions outran what his plague-diminished treasury could actually sustain, and whose later years were marked by the kind of harsh fiscal measures that same treasury shortfall seemed to demand. Both traditions are, in a genuine sense, correct, describing the same man from 2 different vantage points, one measuring his reign by the monuments and laws that survived him, the other by the population and revenue his empire never fully recovered. If the story ended in 542, with Constantinople's worst months finally subsiding and the city gradually returning to something resembling ordinary life, it would already represent one of the more consequential public health catastrophes in ancient history. But the outbreak that began at Pelusium was not, as it turned out, a single isolated event. It was the opening act of what modern historians now call the First Plague Pandemic, a sustained, recurring cycle of outbreaks that would continue returning to the Mediterranean world, and wave after wave, for roughly the next 200 years, not finally subsiding until around 750. Historians have identified somewhere in the range of 15 to 18 distinct, documented recurrences of plague across this 2-century span, striking different regions with varying severity at different times. A pattern epidemiologists studying historical pandemics have come to recognize as broadly typical of how Yersinia pestis behaves once it establishes a durable reservoir among local rodent populations. The bacterium does not simply exhaust itself and vanish after a single outbreak, but instead persists, largely undetected, in animal populations between human epidemics, periodically spilling back over into human communities whenever conditions once again favor that transmission. Each subsequent wave, while generally understood by modern historians to have been somewhat less catastrophic than the initial 541 outbreak, nonetheless continued extracting a real and cumulative toll from a Mediterranean world that had, by the outbreak's third or fourth recurrence, essentially never gotten the chance to fully recover from the wave before it. This recurring pattern helps explain something that a single outbreak narrative alone cannot: why the plague's cumulative demographic and economic impact across the full 200-year period may have been considerably more significant than even the dramatic 541 outbreak suggests, on its own, however severe that first wave genuinely was. A population given decades to fully recover from a single catastrophic event behaves very differently, in economic and demographic terms, than a population repeatedly struck before it has ever finished recovering from the previous blow, and it is this second, considerably less dramatic but arguably more consequential pattern of grinding, repeated recurrence that defines the true two-century arc of the first plague pandemic, rather than the single dramatic year most popular retellings, when they mention this catastrophe at all, tend to focus on exclusively. One particularly severe later recurrence struck in 558, hitting Constantinople itself hard enough that Procopius's continuators recorded mortality once again reaching levels that strained the city's recovered burial infrastructure, a sobering reminder to a generation that had spent nearly 2 decades believing the worst had already passed, that the underlying threat had never actually gone away. Another significant wave arrived in the 570s, and further recurrences continued rippling through various regions of the Mediterranean and Near East across the following century, each one striking a population that had, by necessity, absorbed the grim expectation that plague was no longer a single historical event to be survived and left behind, but a recurring feature of the world they now lived in, liable to return at unpredictable intervals for as long as anyone could reasonably expect to live. Modern epidemiologists studying historical plague reservoirs note that this recurring pattern is entirely consistent with how Yersinia pestis behaves once it becomes established among local wild rodent populations. Since the bacterium does not require repeated reintroduction from some distant original source to keep producing new human outbreaks, it can instead persist for years or decades within a regional rodent population, occasionally flaring into a renewed epizootic event among the rodents themselves that then spills over into nearby human communities whenever local conditions, including rodent population density and flea activity tied to seasonal climate patterns, happen to align. This explains why the plague's later 6th and 7th century recurrences did not require any fresh arrival from Egypt to keep striking the Byzantine and Persian worlds. By that point, the bacterium had, in effect, taken up permanent residence within the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern ecosystem, a genuinely unwelcome and remarkably persistent new resident that the region's human population would now have to share space with for the better part of 2 centuries to come. Living through 2 centuries of recurring plague outbreaks reshaped ordinary Mediterranean life in ways considerably more mundane, and in some respects more genuinely revealing, than the dramatic mass mortality scenes that dominate this account's earlier chapters. Communities that had survived one outbreak learned, gradually and imperfectly, to anticipate and respond to subsequent waves, not through anything resembling modern public health measures, since the actual mechanism of transmission remained entirely unknown to them, but through a kind of accumulated and formal folk wisdom about which behaviors seemed, however imperfectly, to correlate with survival. Some cities developed informal practices around isolating the visibly sick, moving them outside city walls or into designated quarters separate from the healthy population. An intuitive response to an observed pattern of household clustering, even without any theoretical understanding of contagion in the modern sense. Rural populations, and some documented regions, showed a tendency toward smaller, more dispersed settlement patterns across the plague-affected centuries, plausibly, though not definitively, a partial adaptive response to a disease that seemed to spread more readily and more severely through dense, closely packed urban populations than through the more scattered arrangements typical of subsistence farming communities. Though disentangling this possible adaptation from the many other economic and political forces reshaping rural settlement patterns across the same 2 centuries remains, for historians working with genuinely limited evidence, a difficult and not entirely resolved question. Labor itself grew more valuable in the straightforward economic sense that repeated population losses across 2 centuries left a smaller pool of workers to till the same land, staff the same workshops, and crew the same ships that had previously employed considerably more people. Some economic historians have traced modest shifts in the bargaining position of surviving peasants and skilled laborers across the plague-affected centuries to exactly this kind of repeated demographic contraction, a pattern later historians studying the Black Death's own considerably better documented aftermath in 14th century Europe would recognize immediately, since a very similar dynamic, workers gaining leverage in a suddenly labor-scarce economy, played out with even clearer documentary evidence 8 centuries later, when a genetically related strain of the same bacterium returned to finish, in some very real economic sense, a process its distant ancestor had already begun. Marriage and family patterns shifted as well across these recurring decades, according to surviving legal and church records. Some historians have noted an apparent rise in remarriage rates and shorter intervals between a spouse's death and a survivor's subsequent marriage, a plausible, if not conclusively provable, adaptation to a world in which any given household might lose a parent, a spouse, or several children within a single bad season, and in which the ordinary economic and social functions a family unit needed to perform could not simply wait for a lengthy period of mourning before being reassembled. None of these adaptations, taken individually, look especially dramatic against the mass burial pits and imperial succession crises this account's earlier chapters have described. Taken together, across 2 centuries, they describe something arguably more significant still: an entire civilization quietly reorganizing the rhythms of its ordinary domestic life around a thread it could neither explain nor predict, but had, by sheer necessity, learned to live alongside. Craft guilds and urban professional associations, a genuine feature of late antique and early Byzantine city life, show their own traces of this long adaptation as well, with surviving records from several plague-affected cities documenting membership reorganizations and, in some cases, formal changes to apprenticeship rules that historians have connected to repeated losses of skilled tradesmen across the recurring outbreak cycle. A guild that lost a third of its master craftsmen to a single bad plague season could not simply wait a generation for new masters to train through the ordinary, unhurried pace such training normally followed. It needed, instead, to compress apprenticeship timelines, admit less thoroughly trained members earlier than tradition would ordinarily allow, and generally accept a certain erosion of craft standards as the practical price of keeping essential urban trades functioning at all through a period when qualified survivors were simply in genuinely short supply. For the people actually living through these repeated waves of unexplained mass death, the absence of any workable scientific explanation left an enormous void that the 6th and 7th centuries' available religious and cultural frameworks moved quickly, and understandably, to fill. The dominant interpretation across Byzantine Christian society understood the plague as an expression of divine will, a punishment for collective sin, a test of faith, or, in the framework some contemporary churchmen articulated explicitly, a sign of the world's approaching final days, since a catastrophe of this scale seemed, to observers with no other available explanatory framework, to demand a cause proportionate to its genuinely apocalyptic feel. The Church's institutional response, whatever comfort or explanation it offered theologically, also took considerably more practical forms. Clergy organized public prayers and processions specifically aimed at ending outbreaks, a practice recorded across multiple plague-affected cities throughout the 2-century recurring cycle, and church buildings themselves sometimes became informal centers for tending the sick, since the era's genuinely limited medical establishment had little else to offer beyond whatever comfort organized religious community could provide to people facing a disease with no known cure and only the faintest, least reliable folk remedies available as any kind of treatment. Some contemporary accounts describe processions specifically invoking particular saints understood, in the religious framework of the time, to hold special protective power against plague and pestilence, a devotional pattern that would recur, considerably more famously documented, during the Black Death 8 centuries later, when saints associated with plague protection became genuinely central figures in late medieval popular religious practice across Western Europe. Fear, inevitably, produced darker responses alongside these devotional ones, though the 6th century Mediterranean world's own version of blame and scapegoating during plague years remains, in the surviving historical record, considerably less thoroughly documented than the well-known and genuinely tragic pattern of persecution that would accompany the Black Death's 14th century arrival in Western Europe. What does survive suggests a population caught, across 2 exhausting centuries, between genuine religious devotion offered in good faith as the only comfort available, and an undercurrent of fear and suspicion that any community facing repeated, unexplained catastrophe on this scale will likely produce in at least some of its members. A deeply human response to genuine helplessness that this account can note honestly without needing to dwell on it at length. Byzantine art and religious imagery from the plague-affected centuries shows subtler traces of this atmosphere as well, according to art historians who study the period. A documented increase in devotional images and icons specifically associated with intercession and protection, commissioned by individuals and communities seeking, through the era's own available spiritual technology, some measure of agency against a threat no physician could offer them any real defense against. Whether any particular commissioned icon or funded chapel reflected genuine, settled faith or something closer to desperate bargaining with an incomprehensible catastrophe is not a distinction the surviving records allow modern historians to draw with any confidence, and it may not, in the end, be a distinction that mattered very much to the people actually living through it, for whom the line between devotion and desperation, in a world offering so little else, was likely never especially clear to begin with. Islamic tradition, developing in the Arabian Peninsula during roughly this same recurring plague period and reaching its own decisive expansion in the century immediately following, would eventually articulate its own distinct theological framework for understanding plague, one that later Islamic scholars distinguished carefully from the Christian world's emphasis on collective divine punishment, a framework this account will return to only briefly, since a full treatment belongs to a different story than the one told here tonight, but worth noting as a reminder that the plague's 2-century reach touched religious communities considerably beyond the Byzantine Christian and Sasanian Zoroastrian worlds this account has focused on most closely. Jewish communities across the plague-affected Mediterranean, well established in cities from Alexandria to Rome by the 6th century, left behind their own scattered references to the recurring catastrophe and surviving rabbinic and communal records, generally interpreting it within their own considerably older tradition of plague narrative reaching back to the Hebrew Bible's own accounts of pestilence through a framework distinct from either the Christian or emerging Islamic theological responses this account has already described. Taken together, these varied religious responses, Christian, Zoroastrian, Jewish, and the Islamic tradition still taking shape during these same recurring decades, illustrate something worth holding onto as this account moves toward its final chapters, a single biological catastrophe, indifferent to any of humanity's competing explanatory frameworks, nonetheless produced as many distinct interpretations of its meaning as there were distinct communities suffering through it. Return now to the broader geopolitical picture this account examined earlier, the parallel suffering of Byzantium and its great Sasanian Persian rival. Because the 2-century recurring pattern this account has just traced did not stop weakening both empires once the dramatic initial outbreak of 541 had passed. It continued, wave after wave, for generations, and by the early 7th century, both Byzantium and Persia entered a period of renewed, exceptionally destructive open warfare against each other. The Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, fighting a conflict of genuinely staggering mutual cost while both empires' underlying populations and economies were still absorbing the cumulative weight of over 60 years of recurring plague. That war ended, eventually, in a hard-won Byzantine victory under Emperor Heraclius, but it left both empires, the two dominant military and political powers of the entire Middle Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean world, genuinely exhausted, their treasuries drained, their standing armies depleted, and their frontier populations thinned by a combination of decades of warfare layered directly on top of nearly a century of recurring epidemic disease. Neither side could have reasonably anticipated what happened next, because almost nobody in either Constantinople or Ctesiphon in the 620s could have predicted that a new and, to both established empires, genuinely unfamiliar power was about to emerge from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and force that would permanently reshape the entire region within a single generation. Historians continue to debate, with genuine and ongoing scholarly disagreement, exactly how much weight to assign the plague's long cumulative toll, as opposed to the simple exhaustion of decades of Byzantine-Sasanian warfare, and explaining the startling speed of the 7th century Arab conquests that followed, campaigns that stripped Byzantium of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt within roughly a decade, and toppled the entire Sasanian Empire outright within scarcely more time than that. What is not seriously disputed is that both great empires the Arab armies encountered in the 630s were, in genuinely important and measurable ways, considerably weaker versions of the powers they had been a century earlier, populations reduced, treasuries strained, frontier garrisons thinned, and a pandemic that had spent nearly 100 years quietly, repeatedly, undermining both civilizations' underlying strength deserves at least a meaningful share of the explanation for just how quickly and how completely the map of the entire Middle East was about to be redrawn. The Sasanian Empire's fate, in particular, illustrates just how completely this combination of exhaustion could unravel even a genuinely ancient, deeply entrenched imperial system. Within roughly a decade of the plague and war-exhausted 620s, Arab armies had not merely defeated Sasanian forces in the field but toppled the dynasty entirely, ending an imperial line that had ruled Persia in some form for over 4 centuries. A collapse so total and so comparatively rapid that historians of the period still treat it as one of the more startling reversals in the ancient Near East's long history. Byzantium, weakened by the very same combination of factors, avoided a comparably total collapse, but only barely, losing Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, provinces that had supplied a substantial share of its population, tax revenue, and, non-incidentally, the very grain shipments whose interrupted trade routes had carried the plague itself to Constantinople a century earlier, and emerging from the 7th century as a considerably smaller, more defensively postured state than the confidently expansionist Empire Justinian had ruled at his own reign's height. The story of how the bacterium behind both the Justinianic plague and the Black Death finally received its scientific name belongs to a third, considerably more recent pandemic, one this account has not yet mentioned, but that connects directly to the modern scientific tools that eventually confirmed everything this account has described about the 6th century. In 1894, a new outbreak of plague erupted in Hong Kong, part of what epidemiologists now call the Third Plague Pandemic, a global wave of outbreaks that had begun decades earlier in China's Yunnan province and would, over the following decades, spread by steamship to port cities on every inhabited continent, ultimately killing more than 12 million people, the overwhelming majority of them in India, before finally subsiding in the mid-20th century. It was during this Hong Kong outbreak that a Swiss-French physician and bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin, working independently of a competing Japanese research team investigating the same epidemic, successfully isolated and identified the specific bacterium responsible, the first time in human history that anyone had actually seen, under a microscope, the organism that had been killing people in recurring waves since at least the 6th century, quite possibly considerably longer. The bacterium was formally named Yersinia pestis in his honor decades later, permanently attaching a 19th century scientist's name to a killer whose documented human history, as this account has spent the previous chapters demonstrating, actually stretches back well over 1,300 years before Yersin ever looked through his microscope in a makeshift Hong Kong laboratory. This third pandemic, and the bacteriological breakthroughs it produced, gave 20th century scientists their first genuine biological understanding of what plague actually was, not divine punishment, not poisoned air, but a specific bacterium, transmitted by a specific insect vector, living in a specific set of rodent hosts, and it is precisely this foundational 19th century science, built on Yersin's identification of the organism itself, that made the 21st century ancient. DNA techniques this account will turn to next even possible in the first place. Without Yersin's microscope in 1894, there would have been no genetic sequence to compare against the DNA later extracted from 6th century teeth in Bavaria. No way, in other words, for modern researchers to finally prove what Procopius, John of Ephesus, and every anonymous provincial chronicler this account has drawn on could only describe, never explain. Yersin's own career adds a small, human coda worth mentioning. Rather than returning to a comfortable academic post in Europe after his Hong Kong discovery, he spent much of the remainder of his life in French Indochina, founding medical institutes, introducing rubber and quinine-producing plants to the region, and continuing scientific work largely removed from the European scientific establishment that might otherwise have more loudly celebrated his discovery during his own lifetime. He died in 1943, largely without the widespread public recognition later generations would eventually grant him, his name attached permanently to the bacterium only through the retrospective judgment of the scientific community that followed, a quiet ending, in its own way, For the man whose microscope first made it possible for science to eventually reach all the way back across 14 centuries and confirm exactly what had happened in Constantinople in the terrible year 542. For nearly 15 centuries, the true biological cause of the 6th century catastrophe this account has been describing remained a matter of educated inference rather than direct proof. Historians reading Procopius's description of buboes and comparing it, reasonably, to the far better documented symptoms of the Black Death, and concluding, on the strength of that comparison alone, that the two catastrophes were probably caused by the same underlying disease. Reasonable as that inference was, it remained, for centuries, exactly that, an inference, drawn from descriptive symptoms recorded by observers with no access to anything resembling modern diagnostic tools, rather than anything approaching direct scientific proof. That changed, decisively, in the early 21st century through the emerging science of ancient DNA analysis. In 2013, a team of researchers examining human remains from a 6th century burial site at Ascium in Bavaria successfully extracted and sequenced genetic material from the dental pulp of individuals buried there, a technique that has become, over the past 2 decades, one of the single most powerful tools available to historians and archaeologists studying ancient disease, since the pulp inside a tooth, protected by enamel from centuries of environmental degradation, can preserve genetic traces of pathogens that circulated in a person's bloodstream at the moment of their death. The genetic material recovered from the Ascium remains matched Yersinia pestis conclusively, providing, for the first time in the roughly 15 centuries since the outbreak actually occurred, direct physical proof of exactly which pathogen had caused the 6th century pandemic Procopius had described from the inside, and Constantinople, all those centuries earlier. Subsequent studies, examining additional burial sites across the broader geographic range the plague is documented to have affected, have reinforced and refined this initial finding considerably, allowing researchers to reconstruct not just the bare fact of Yersinia pestis' involvement, but increasingly detailed genetic information about the specific strain responsible, its likely evolutionary origin, and its relationship to other historical and modern plague outbreaks. What had been, for 15 centuries, an educated guess grounded in symptomatic comparison alone had finally become, through genuinely remarkable modern science extracting genetic evidence from teeth over 1,400 years old, a matter of confirmed historical fact. Since that initial 2013 breakthrough, archaeologists working across the plague's documented geographic range have identified and tested additional burial sites in England, France, and Spain, steadily building a genetic map of the pandemic's reach that increasingly corroborates the written sources this account has relied on throughout: Gregory of Tours' account of outbreaks in Frankish Gaul, John of Ephesus' testimony from the Syrian countryside, and Procopius' own detailed narrative from inside Constantinople itself, each of them now independently supported by physical, genetic evidence recovered directly from the remains of people who actually lived through, and in these specific cases died from, the exact catastrophe they or their contemporaries had once tried to describe in words alone. It is a genuinely rare thing in historical research to watch a nearly 1,500-year-old written record and a 21st century laboratory finding arrive, independently, at precisely the same conclusion. And it is exactly this convergence of ancient testimony and modern genetics that gives this account's version of the 6th century a level of confidence historians studying this period could only have dreamed of a generation ago. The technique itself, formerly known as ancient DNA analysis or paleogenomics, has since expanded well beyond plague research alone, reshaping entire fields of archaeology and ancient history by allowing researchers to identify pathogens, trace ancient population migrations, and even reconstruct family relationships between individuals buried thousands of years apart, all from genetic material that, for most of the 20th century, scientists assumed had simply degraded beyond any possibility of recovery. The Ascium burial site that first confirmed Yersinia pestis' role in the Justinianic plague was, in this sense, not an isolated triumph but an early, foundational success in a scientific field that continues, to this day, to rewrite portions of the ancient historical record once thought permanently unrecoverable. That same genetic research has allowed scientists to answer a question historians could never have resolved on their own: exactly how the 6th century Justinianic outbreak relates, biologically, to the far more famous Black Death that struck the same broader region 800 years later, beginning in 1347. The two catastrophes are, without question, caused by the same bacterial species, Yersinia pestis, confirmed through ancient DNA in burial sites associated with both pandemics. But the genetic relationship between them is considerably more nuanced than simply saying the same disease struck twice, and getting this nuance right matters for understanding what these two catastrophes actually tell us about how this bacterium behaves across deep historical time. Phylogenetic analysis, essentially, comparing the genetic family trees of plague samples recovered from both pandemics, indicates that the strain responsible for the Justinianic outbreak represents a genetically distinct branch of Yersinia pestis, one that appears to have gone extinct sometime after the first pandemic finally subsided around 750. Rather than persisting continuously to later re-emerge as the strain behind the Black Death centuries afterward. The 14th century pandemic instead traces to a separate, later emergence of the same bacterial species from its ongoing natural reservoir among wild rodent populations, most likely originating in Central Asia, an independent spillover event rather than a direct genetic continuation of the 6th century outbreak, meaning these were, in the most precise scientific sense, two separate pandemics caused by the same species of bacterium emerging from its natural rodent reservoir on two separate historical occasions, roughly 800 years apart, rather than one continuous outbreak somehow lying dormant across the intervening centuries. This distinction, admittedly a fairly technical one, matters because it reframes what this entire story ultimately demonstrates. It is not the story of a single ancient catastrophe that happened, coincidentally, to recur once more centuries later. It is the story of a genuinely persistent biological threat, a bacterium capable, evidently, of repeatedly finding its way out of the wild rodent populations where it quietly persists between outbreaks and into dense human civilization, not once but at least twice across recorded history, each time exploiting the same basic vulnerabilities: crowded cities, extensive trade networks, and populations with no meaningful biological or medical defense against it. Understanding that pattern, rather than treating the Black Death as some singular, unprecedented historical anomaly, is precisely why the story you are hearing tonight deserves to be told at all. A third, smaller wave of Yersinia pestis emergence followed even the Black Death itself, producing recurring European outbreaks across the following few centuries, including, notably, London's Great Plague of 1665, before the disease's presence in Western Europe finally faded, followed, centuries later, by the 19th century third pandemic this account has already described, originating independently in China. Three genuinely separate historical emergences, by modern genetic reckoning, spanning roughly 14 centuries from the 6th century to the 20th, each one a fresh spillover from the same enduring wild rodent reservoir rather than one continuous outbreak somehow persisting the entire time, a pattern that should, by rights, unsettle the comfortable assumption that plague is purely a phenomenon of the distant past, since the bacterium itself has never actually gone extinct and continues, to this day, to circulate quietly among wild rodent populations on several continents, including the western United States, occasionally still producing isolated modern human cases entirely treatable with modern antibiotics, but never fully, permanently eliminated from the natural world it has called home for as long as humans have kept written records at all. Modern medicine has, of course, transformed what any of this actually means for present-day risk. A confirmed case of bubonic plague today, identified early and treated with modern antibiotics, carries a fatality rate reduced from the historical 30 to 60% range down to a small single-digit percentage in most well-resourced healthcare settings. An almost unimaginable reversal of fortune for a disease that once emptied ancient capital cities, and a genuinely reassuring note for anyone who spends the remainder of this evening wondering whether the modern world still has anything real to fear from the bacterium that features so heavily in tonight's story. It does not, provided modern public health infrastructure and modern medicine remain available and are used promptly, a fairly significant caveat, but one that, for the overwhelming majority of listeners hearing this account, changes an ancient horror story into something closer to a historical curiosity, genuinely survived rather than genuinely still feared. Given everything this account has now covered, a death toll credibly comparable, in relative terms, to the Black Deaths, a geographic reach spanning 3 continents, a documented, lasting impact on the trajectory of 2 of the era's greatest empires, it is worth pausing directly on the question this entire account opened with: why does almost nobody know this story? While the Black Death remains one of the most widely recognized events in all of medieval history, the answer turns out to involve several genuinely distinct factors, working together rather than any single, simple explanation. Documentation is the first and probably the most significant factor. The Black Death struck a considerably more literate, more densely record-keeping medieval Europe, one that produced an enormous volume of surviving chronicles, personal letters, municipal records, and administrative documents describing its course in granular, geographically widespread detail. The Justinianic plague, by contrast, survives in the historical record primarily through a comparatively small number of major sources, Procopius chief among them, supplemented by scattered regional chronicles considerably thinner in both volume and geographic coverage than what 14th century Europe would eventually leave behind. A less thoroughly documented catastrophe, however genuinely severe, simply has less raw material available for later historians, novelists, and popular culture to draw on and dramatize. Timing and cultural proximity play a real role as well. The Black Death struck a Western Europe whose institutions, art, literature, and even the modern nations that would eventually study it, developed in comparatively unbroken continuity from the 14th century onward. English and French national historical memory, for instance, could trace an essentially continuous cultural thread back to the exact society the Black Death struck. The Justinianic plague struck a late antique Mediterranean world considerably more distant, both in time and in cultural continuity, from the nations and institutions that would eventually write and popularize most of the world's historical scholarship, leaving it comparatively unmoored from any single modern national narrative eager to claim and retell it. The result, across the centuries since, has been a kind of quiet historical asymmetry, one genuinely comparable catastrophe woven deeply into popular memory, and its near equal, arriving 800 years earlier, left largely to specialists, footnotes, and, until recently, to the slow, patient work of scientists extracting its true story directly from ancient teeth. Popular culture has reinforced this asymmetry considerably further across the past century, since the Black Death has been the subject of countless novels, films, and, more recently, documentaries and popular history books, each new retelling reinforcing its position in the wider public imagination as the definitive medieval pandemic, while the Justinianic plague, until relatively recently, rarely appeared in any of that same popular material at all. The recent wave of genetic research this account has drawn on throughout has begun, gradually, to change that imbalance, generating renewed academic and, increasingly, popular interest in the 6th century catastrophe precisely because modern science has finally given it the kind of concrete, verifiable narrative that had previously belonged almost exclusively to its far more famous 14th century successor. Stepping back now across the full 200-year arc this account has traced, the Justinianic plague's true legacy is considerably harder to capture in any single dramatic image than the crowded burial pits of 542 Constantinople. However vivid and however historically real those scenes genuinely were. Its more lasting impact lived instead in the slow, cumulative reshaping of an entire region's trajectory, a Byzantine empire that reached its greatest territorial extent under Justinian only to spend the following century absorbing a demographic and fiscal wound the plague had helped inflict. A Sasanian Persia weakened in broadly parallel fashion, and, ultimately, two exhausted superpowers whose 7th century collapse and contraction, respectively, opened space for one of history's most rapid and consequential territorial transformations, as Arab armies carried a new faith and a new political order across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East within a single remarkable generation. The Mediterranean trade networks that had carried the plague so efficiently in 541 never fully returned to their pre-plague density for centuries afterward, a contraction some economic historians connect to the broader pattern of reduced long-distance Mediterranean commerce characterizing much of the following early medieval period, though, as with the plague's mortality figures, the exact share of that broader economic contraction attributable to the plague specifically, as opposed to the political fragmentation and warfare of the same centuries, remains a genuinely contested question among specialists rather than a settled fact. What can be said with more confidence is that the world emerging from the plague's 2-century recurring cycle, around 750, looked meaningfully different from the world Justinian had ruled at his own reign's confident, expansionist height, a Mediterranean no longer dominated by a single reconquering Roman successor state, but instead divided among a Byzantine empire reduced to a fraction of its former territory, an entirely new Islamic caliphate controlling what had recently been Byzantine and Sasanian heartland alike, and a Western Europe continuing its own long, gradual process of political fragmentation into the world that would eventually become medieval Christendom. None of this unfolded because of the plague alone, and this account has tried, throughout, to resist the temptation of treating a single pandemic as the sole explanation for changes that plainly involved warfare, religion, politics, and human decision-making operating alongside it across two genuinely complicated centuries. But strip the plague out of that 2-century story entirely, and the timeline that actually happened becomes considerably harder to explain, which is, in the end, as close to a confident verdict as the surviving evidence for a 1,500-year-old pandemic can responsibly support, not the sole cause of an era's transformation, but a genuine, measurable, and for a very long time nearly forgotten contributor to it. The Byzantine Empire that did survive into this new, considerably smaller world did not simply fade away, and it is worth this account noting, before it closes, that the story does not end in ruin. Constantinople itself would endure for another 8 centuries after the plague's final major recurrence, weathering further wars, further crises, and further transformations, right up until its eventual fall to Ottoman forces in 1453. The plague reshaped the empire's trajectory, narrowed its ambitions, and closed off possibilities that had briefly seemed within reach during Justinian's most confident years, but it did not, in the end, extinguish the state itself, which is, in its own understated way, a genuinely remarkable testament to just how much sustained catastrophe a sufficiently resilient civilization can absorb and still, eventually, find some way to continue. The Sasanian Empire's own successor states, and the broader Persian cultural and linguistic identity that outlived the dynasty's 7th century political collapse, followed a similarly resilient long arc despite the empire itself never being restored. Persian language, literature, and administrative tradition persisted and eventually flourished again under subsequent Islamic-era dynasties, a reminder that the plague's genuine, measurable role in weakening 2 ancient empires did not equate to erasing the civilizations those empires had been built upon, which, in both the Byzantine and Persian cases, proved considerably more durable than the specific political structures the plague had helped undermine. Western Europe's own long medieval trajectory, developing across these same plague-touched centuries at a considerable remove from Constantinople and Ctesiphon alike, absorbed its own share of the first pandemic's recurring waves. Gregory of Tours' Frankish outbreaks were only one part of a broader Western European experience that historians increasingly recognize as genuinely continuous with, rather than separate from, the Eastern Mediterranean catastrophe this account has spent most of its attention on. The fragmented, regionally fractured Europe that would eventually give rise to medieval Christendom's kingdoms and principalities did not develop in isolation from this pandemic story. It developed, in part, through it, absorbing its own demographic and economic disruption from the same recurring bacterium, steadily reshaping the entire late antique world at once, West and East alike, for the better part of 200 years. Return, finally, to where this account began, to the claim that the Black Death was neither history's first great pandemic nor, relative to the world it struck, necessarily its deadliest. You have now heard the story that claim was pointing toward a sickness that began in an Egyptian grain port in 541, traveled the same trade routes that had made the ancient Mediterranean prosperous, emptied a capital city of 500,000 people at a rate its own court historians struggled to find words adequate to describe, felled an emperor and nearly toppled his throne with him, weakened 2 rival superpowers in tandem across nearly a century of recurrence, and helped set the stage, almost invisibly, for one of the most rapid territorial transformations in recorded history, all of it largely forgotten by the wider world for roughly 1,500 years, until scientists extracting genetic material from centuries-old teeth finally gave it back its true name. The 2 pandemics this account has now placed side by side, Justinian's plague and the Black Death that followed it 8 centuries later, were not, as the science now makes clear, a single continuous catastrophe stretching improbably across the centuries, but something in some ways more unsettling, 2 entirely separate emergences of the same bacterial species, arising independently from the same natural reservoir, exploiting the same basic vulnerabilities of dense human civilization on two separate historical occasions, 800 years apart. A single ancient disaster is a tragedy of its particular moment. A pattern that recurs, unrelated pandemic after unrelated pandemic, separated by centuries but rooted in the same basic biological vulnerability, is something closer to a standing feature of human history itself, one that did not end with either the 6th century's recovery or the 14th century's, and that modern epidemiology continues, carefully and deliberately, to study for exactly that reason. Consider, finally, everyone this account has introduced you to across the last 2 hours, Procopius, watching from inside a dying city and unable to decide, even in his own private writing, whether the emperor he served deserved admiration or contempt. John of Ephesus, walking through silent Syrian towns no other chronicler thought to record, Justinian himself, surviving the very catastrophe that would slowly undercut the ambitions of his remaining years, and, most recently of all, the anonymous dead of Ascium, Bavaria, whose teeth, examined nearly 15 centuries after their burial, finally gave the entire story its scientific proof. None of them could see the whole shape of the story you have just heard. Procopius never knew about ancient DNA. The Bavarian dead never knew their teeth would one day speak for an empire whose language they may not have even shared. It is only from this considerable distance, with 15 centuries of hindsight and a genuine alliance between old chronicles and new laboratories, that the full shape of the Plague of Justinian finally becomes visible at all, which is, perhaps, the last understated lesson this particular story has to offer, that history's truest shape is very often only visible long after everyone who lived it is gone. You came into this evening, perhaps, thinking of the Black Death as history's original catastrophe, the plague against which all others are measured. You leave it, instead, with an older story restored to its rightful place. A 6th century Mediterranean world that came astonishingly close to a catastrophe historians once genuinely worried might unmake civilization as it was then understood, survived by an emperor who very nearly did not survive it himself, and remembered, in the end, not by the great monuments Justinian built in more triumphant years, but by a handful of ancient teeth, patiently examined 15 centuries later, that finally told the truth his own court historian could describe but never fully explain. Let the ancient Mediterranean world rest now, its worst years long past, its true story finally told in full, and let sleep come the way it always eventually does, gradually, gently, and, for you tonight, without anything left unresolved. Somewhere beneath modern Istanbul, beneath layers of Ottoman and Byzantine and late antique construction stacked one atop another across 15 centuries of continuous habitation, the ground still holds traces of that terrible year, foundations, fragments, and, in a few documented archaeological excavations, burial evidence consistent with the very catastrophe this account has spent tonight describing. The city built new. The empire, in its diminished way, endured. And an emperor who had once watched his own capital nearly fall silent recovered, ruled for 2 decades more, and left behind monuments, the Hagia Sophia chief among them, that still stand today, largely unaware, to anyone simply admiring their scale and beauty, of the invisible catastrophe their builders survived in the middle of raising them. That, perhaps, is the quietest and most fitting way this particular story could end, not with the plague itself, but with a dome, still standing, built by a man the plague nearly killed, and a city that outlasted it.